We begin the Gemara today right at the top of Daf Chafei Amar Aleph. Ve'ela mai. So this is actually in the middle of a discussion here on a Braise. Rabbi Yossi says, Gedoyla Chazaka. The Chazaka is very great. What is he speaking about? The Kainim that came up from Bavel in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, and these Kainim couldn't establish their yichus. And therefore Ezra tells them that they can't eat from the Kachim in the Beis HaMikdash, they can't serve as the Kainim in the Beis HaMikdash, but they could still keep their Chazaka as they were Kainim until today, and that is to eat Trumeh or to do Birchas Kainim. And the Gemara explained that even if we're going to say that usually someone that eats Trumeh, we could use that to establish that he's a Kain even for Yichus. Or someone that does Birchas Kainim, we could use that to establish that he's a Kain for Yichus. But over here we're not going to be concerned that people will come to say that they are Meyuchas as a Kain, because over here we can see that their Chazaka as Kainim has been weakened. Because we're not allowing them to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. We're not allowing them to eat Kachim. So that's why over here, we can't prove from here, there's no connection from this that they eat Trumeh or they do Birchas Kainim to this that they will become Kainim for the Yichus as well. So now, the Gemara continues and asks on this, Ve'ela mai gedoyla chazaka. So if so, this expression that the Braise begins with, that look how great this chazaka here is, what exactly is so great about this chazaka? Why should we not use this chazaka? What's unique about this chazaka that we're saying, look how great it is? There's no concern that by using this chazaka, we're going to come to elevate them to yichus also, as we've explained. If so, there's no chiddush in the fact that we're using this chazaka. So the Gemara answers, what's great about this chazaka is that earlier they would only eat trumeh, which is midarabanan. Hashta achol betrumeh dairaisa. And now they can eat trumeh minat Torah. Because when they're in Bavel, in Galos, over there is no trumeh minat Torah. Trumeh minat Torah is only in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore now when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they're being allowed to even eat trumeh minat Torah. That's how strong their chazaka of eating trumeh is. Or the Gemara says another pshat to explain how great this chazaka here is. Hashtanami, when it says Vibayiseime, the Gemara is explaining why over here, from the fact that they eat trumeh, why would this not be used to also establish their status for yichus as kainim? So the Gemara says, we're at the top of Chafei Amar Aleph, Vibayiseime, a second pshat we can say is Hashtanami betrumeh the Rabbanan achol. They could only eat trumeh, which is midarabanan. Just like when they were in Bavel, the trumeh they were eating is only midarabanan. So now as well, even in Eretz Yisrael, they could only eat trumeh midarabanan. As Rashi says, that would mean trumeh from fruit trees or vegetables, which are only midarabanan. But trumeh deiraisa lo yachol, and trumeh minat Torah they will not be able to eat. V'chi chafei amar aleph. V'chi maskinon mitrumeh leyuchsin. This that we said before, according to one opinion, that when we see Kainim eating Trumeh, so based on this, we could also establish his status as a Kain for Yichus as well. But Trumeh Deiraisa, that's only if he eats Trumeh Minat Torah. But Trumeh Derabanan, like, but if the Kain could only eat Trumeh Derabanan, we're not going to use that as a basis to establish his Yichus as a Kain. Like Maskina, we will not establish his status as a Kain for Yichus. So the Gemara now asks similar question to what it asked before. Ve'ela mai gedoyla chazaka. So why does Rabbi Yossi say, look how powerful the chazaka of these kainim are that we're allowing them to eat this trumeh? What's so unique about this chazaka? We're only allowing them to eat this same trumeh derabanan that they ate before. Answers the Gemara, no, there is a chiddush here. Even though by allowing them to eat the trumeh derabanan, you may think that we should decree that they might come to eat trumeh minat Torah as well. They'll confuse the two. But nevertheless, we don't make such a decree. We allow them to eat the trumeh derabanan, even though they're not allowed to eat the trumeh minat Torah. Now the Gemara asks on this second answer here, these Kainim here that came up from Bavel and they couldn't establish their yichus, they were not allowed to eat trumeh minat Torah. But vaksiv, it says in the pasuk, as was quoted before, they should not eat from Kodesh HaKadoshim, meaning they shouldn't eat from the Kachim in the Beis HaMikdash. What do we understand from this? Kodesh HaKadoshim hu de lo yachol. They're not allowed to eat from the Kachim of the Beis HaMikdash. But to eat trumeh, even from trumeh which is minat Torah, they are allowed to eat. So how could you tell me that they could only continue eating truma midrabanan, which they ate before when they were in Bavel? So the Gemara answers, no, there's a different way how to interpret this pasuk. This is how we have to read the pasuk. Loi b'midi the ikri kodesh. They should not be eating anything which is called kodesh, and this actually refers to truma. Where do we find that truma is called kodesh in the Torah? So the Gemara brings a pasuk. There's in one place where the pasuk is speaking about truma, and it says there, v'chol zar lo yechal kodesh. And a zar, Yisrael, should not eat from kodesh. And it's clear in that pasuk, as Rashi brings, that it's talking about truma. So when it says before in the pasuk, asher lo yechlu mi kodesh hakadoshim, he was saying to them two different things. First of all, they shouldn't eat kodesh, and that refers to truma. And then also, v'lo b'midi dikri kachim, and then they shouldn't eat from kachim, and this refers to the kachim in the Beis Hamikdash, different portions of the animal that was given to the Kainim. Usually the breast and the thigh was separated from the carbon and given to the Kainim, so they should not eat from that. The chsiv uvas kayin kisiyeh leish zar. So this is speaking about a bas kayin. So as long as she wasn't married, she's allowed to eat from this chaza and shaykh from the kachim in her father's house. But then when she gets married to a Yisrael, so now she loses that ability to eat from the kachim in her father's house. And then it says, Hi betrumas hakachim loy seichel. She cannot eat from trumas hakachim. What does this expression of trumas hakachim mean? V'amamar, so it was explained that it means b'muram min hakachim loy seichel. Those parts of the animal that comes from the kachim, the chaza and the shaykh, she should not eat from that. And that's what the pasuk here was referring to as well. That the Kainim were told that they can't eat any trumim in Torah, and they can't eat kachim as well. They could only eat the trumim midrabanan that they ate when they were in Galus Bavel. Okay, the Gemara now returns and tries to prove the original question it had before, which is, when you see a Kayin that's doing Birchas Kayinim, could that be used as a basis to establish him as a good Kayin for his yichus? Tashema, so come and prove this from the following brayse. It says as follows: Chazake l'kohona. In order to establish a chazake, a status of a person to be a kayin. So what do we use here? Nesiyas kapayim bebavel. In Bavel, if you see a kayin doing birchas kayinim, you could know that he's a kosher kayin. And Rashi explains the reason is because in Bavel there was a bezdin, there was rabbanim there, and they wouldn't allow someone that's not a kayin to do birchas kayinim. Now, v'achilas chala b'Suria. In Syria, which is a section near Eretz Yisrael, of course, I guess in today's modern Syria, somewhere in that area, or it's also called sometimes Aram Tzaiva, and that's an area which David HaMelech conquered it. So it's not considered to be part of Eretz Yisrael necessarily, but David HaMelech himself went and conquered this area. So actually there's a big argument about this, which is brought in many places, whether this place that he conquered has the status like Eretz Yisrael or not. And the Tana of this Braisa is of the opinion that even though David HaMelech is a single person, Kibush Yochid, he conquered it alone, but nevertheless, it has the status like a place in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, in this place, Surya, when you see this individual eating from the challah that's separated from the dough, so you could know that he's a kayin. Or another way how you could establish someone as a kayin, v'chiluk matonis. If they're distributing the matonis, what do these matonis refer to? So Rashi says this refers to the sections of an animal that's supposed to be given to a kayin. L'chayayim v'keva, the cheek and certain parts of the stomach of every animal that's supposed to be given to a kayin. Now, this is not something that has necessarily an isser. There's no isser for anybody to eat from this. It's a gift. It's a gift for the kayin. It belongs to the kayin. So if there's somebody that comes along and is accepting this as a gift, bekrachin, in a big city, in public, and everybody sees this. So over here, even though this is not something where he's taking truma or challah, which it would be forbidden for him to take, but it's just a money issue. He's taking something that belongs to the kayin, but if he's doing this publicly, he wouldn't have the chutzpah to publicly take something that belongs to a kayin. So therefore, that's enough to establish a status as a kayin. Now, katani mis, what's the first thing it said here in this braisa? Nesiyas kapayim. That if you see in Bavel, a kayin is doing birchas kayinim, we could then elevate him to the status of a kayin. My love, don't you think the braisa means liyuchsen? That we're going to establish a status as a kayin for the yichus. That was our whole question. Can we use birchas kayinim to establish a status for his yichus? And here we see we can't. Says the Gemara, no, the braisa doesn't say that clearly. Loy l'trumah. All the braisa meant is you could establish a status as a kayin that'll be allowed to eat trumah. Says the Gemara, but how could you say this? What did it say afterwards in the Braise? Establishing his status as a kain here regarding birchas kainim is similar to what it said in the next case in the Braise, a person in Syria that was eating challah. And there you were saying that you're using that to establish a status as a kain. So now, over there, we're establishing a status to be a kain for yichus, not to eat truma. Because if he's eating challah and truma are the exact same thing. We don't have to establish a status to be able to eat truma. He's eating challah, so then he's eating truma as well already. So we're only using this to establish a status as a kayin for the yichus. So just like there, it's for the yichus, after Nesias Kapayim liyuchsin. So doesn't that mean that in the beginning of the Braisa, so when it talks about Nesias Kapayim, it also means that we're going to use this to establish his status as a kayin for his yichus? So the Gemara answer is no, not necessarily. Loi achilas chala gufa litruma. Even when it speaks about using his status to establish him as a kain regarding chala, it's also only for establishing the status that he could also eat truma. Now, even though we just asked, chala and truma are the same thing, so the Gemara will now explain, not necessarily. Bizman hazeh, chala and truma are not the same. Kesovar, the Tana of this Braisa holds, chala bizman hazeh, the Rabbanon. The chala we separate today is only with the Rabbanon. But the truma today is minatayre. So what is this Braisa saying? Umaskinon mechala the rabbanon letrume doiraisa. When we see that he's eating challah, which is only with the rabbanon, we use that as a proof to establish his status that he's also a kain to eat the truma, which is minatayre. And now here the Gemara points to where we find this concept that challah is only with the rabbanon and truma is minatayre. Ukida'apich luhu Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua l'Rabbanon. There was a conversation that Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua had with the Rabbanon, which the Gemara is going to quote soon. And there, Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua reversed the Rabbanon's opinion, and there we see this point that challah today is the Rabbanon and truma today is minat Torah. What that conversation was, as I said, we'll see soon in the Gemara. But first, the Gemara tries to bring another ayah from a different Braisa regarding this subject, whether we could use Berchas Kayanim to establish the status of a Kayin, the Yichus of a Kayin. Tashamas, the Braisa says, Chazake lekohona. How do you establish kohona? Nesias Kapayim, if you see that he's doing Berchas Kayanim, or V'chilu Granis, over there by the storage houses where they distribute the Truma, and this individual is going and accepting Truma by the storage houses. B'Eretz Yisrael. So in Eretz Yisrael, this is how we establish him as a Kayin. B'Soria, now if it's in Syria, or a place that the shluchim, that Bezdin would send out in Rosh Chodesh to let people know when the new month was established. So Rashi says they would send people to a place that was within 15 days of a distance to get there, to let them know about the Rosh Chodesh. Because if it's further than 15 days, then there's no point of sending shluchim there, because then that's past the Yom Tov of Pesach, which is the 15th day of the month, or Sukkot, which is the 15th day of the month. So we're talking over here about a place where the shluchim could arrive there within 15 days. So in these areas, Nesias Kapayim Raya, the Berchas Kayanim is a raya that he's a Kayin, avaloi chilogranis. But the fact that he's accepting the Truma in the storage houses, that's not going to be a raya that he's a Kayin. And the reason is, as Rashi says, the Tana of this Braisa disagrees with what we said before. The previous Tana held that Syria is the same as Eretz Yisrael. Even though David HaMelech conquered it himself, Kibush Yachid, but it's the same as Eretz Yisrael. The Tana of this Braisa, however, holds that Syria does not have the same status as Eretz Yisrael. So the fact that he's receiving this Truma in Syria, that's not any Truma Minat Torah, so we can't use that to establish him being a Kain. And then the Braisa adds, Ubavel Kesuria. Bavel has the same status as Syria. As we said before, in Bavel you see someone doing Berchas Kayanim. It's a place where there are Talmidei Chachamim there, so they must have verified that he's a Kayin. Rab Shimon Gamliel says, Af Alexandria Shal Mitzrayim, Alexandria, in Mitzrayim, Bari Shaina, in the earlier years, they would also prove that he's a Kayin, based on this that he did Berchas Kayanim, Mipnei Shebezn Kvuim Sham, because there was an established Bezdin there, and they definitely took care of these matters. If they allowed him to do Berchas Kayanim, it must be that they knew he's a Kayin. So again, the Gemara says, Katani Miyas, so what does it say here? Nesias Kapayim, that we're basing the status of his Kohona on the fact that he's doing the Nesias Kapayim. My love, don't you think this means for what? L'yochasin, to establish him to be a Kayin for the Yichus. So the Gemara answers again, Loi l'chala, we're establishing his status that he's allowed to take the challah separated from dough. but not for the yichus. So again, the Gemara asks a similar question to what we asked before. Hadum yidechilu granis katani. We're saying over here, establishing a status similar to what it said afterwards regarding establishing his status as a kohen when he went and receives the trumah in the storage houses. Just like over there, when we are establishing a status as a kohen, when he comes to receive the trumah, that is referring to yuchsin, after Nesias Kapayim lo yuchsin. For Nesias Kapayim, it's also only for yuchsin. So again, at this point, the Gemara was thinking that challah and trumah are the exact same thing. So there'd be no point to say that we're establishing as a kohen for challah because we see him eating trumah. Trumah and challah are the same. So it must be that when it says that he gets trumah, we give him a status of a kohen, it means for yichus. So we could prove from here that we're using Birchas Kohanim as well to establish his yichus. So the Gemara says, again, similar to what it said before, but here the Gemara says that in the opposite way, that no, loy chilu granois gufe l'chala. We're establishing him that he's a kohen when we see him getting the trumah where it's being distributed for him being allowed to eat challah. Now, why do we have to establish that? If he's already eating trumah, of course he could eat the challah. So this Tana of this Braisa holds the reverse of what we said before. Kasavar, he holds trumah bizman hazeh d'Rabbanan. It's the trumah that today is only d'Rabbanan. V'challah d'Oraisa. And the challah today is min Torah. And therefore the point is, umaskinan mitrumah d'Rabbanan l'challah d'Oraisa. We elevate and we establish a status that he could eat the challah min Torah if we saw him accepting the trumah d'Rabbanan. So basically, as we saw here in the two answers of the Gemara is giving us two opinions regarding the challah and the trumah b'zman hazeh. One opinion is that challah b'zman hazeh is min Torah and the trumah is midrabanan, and another opinion is the reverse. Trumah b'zman hazeh is min Torah and the challah is midrabanan. So now here the Gemara brings the source of this. There's a conversation between Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua and the Rabbanan. O kedashkechinu Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua the Rabbanan. Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua found the Rabbanan, the Omar. Where is this? He found the Rabbanan. Again, Ashkechinu Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua the Rabbanan, and the Omar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua, because Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua said the following: Ashkechtinu le Rabbanan beveirav. I found the Rabbanan where? In the Bismedrash. The Yasvi v'Kamri. They were sitting and saying the following halacha. Even the opinion that says that Truma today is only with Rabbanon, Chale doiraisa, but Chale today is min Torah. What's the difference? Shaharei, because we see before that Chale, you're chayev on Chale, even in a time period when you're not chayev for Truma. And when is that? Shaharei zayin shekivshu v'zayin shechilku. The 7 years that Yidden spent conquering Eretz Yisrael, and then the 7 years it took them to distribute the land for everyone. All this time they were obligated in the midst of Chala. But in this time period they were not chayiv in Truma. So Rashi here brings the sources for this, because the term the Torah uses when Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, usually it says kisavai, kisavayu, but over here by Chala the Torah uses a different expression, bivoyachem. And therefore the Gemara says that bivoyachem means as soon as you enter. And also Rashi says, we find regarding Truma and Meiser that it's related to Shemitah. And Shemitah, you only chayiv after they conquered Eretz Yisrael fully and they divided the lands, so then that's when it applies. So therefore Truma and Meiser connected to Shemitah only applies then. But Chala applies right away, as soon as they enter into Eretz Yisrael. So we see here that Chala is a mitzvah that is stringent, it applies right away. So therefore they said the same as today as well. Even though there's no mitzvah of Truma today, min Torah, but there is still the mitzvah of Chala, min Torah. Now, so Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua says, and I said to them, Adarabah, on the contrary, even the opinion that says that Truma today is min Torah, Chala d'Rabbanan. Chala today is only min Rabbanan. Netanya, and he brought a brayso that says as follows: B'voyachem alaretz. By Chala, the Torah says when you come into the land. So again, as I pointed out before, the Gemara says the pasuk that it says b'voyachem. B'voyachem is a unique term that it doesn't use by other mitzvahs when it speaks about coming to Eretz Yisrael. So now, b'voyachem, when it says this unique term of b'voyachem, yachom mishenichnasu lo shnayim mishloishim meraglim. I would think that it means if 2 or 3 meraglim of spies of Yidden enter into Eretz Yisrael, meaning even if very few of Yidden already entered into Eretz Yisrael, but the rest did not enter yet, I would think as soon as a few individuals of Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, they should immediately be chayiv and chala. Talmud loymar, so the pasuk says, no, b'voy achem. And this means bevias kulchem. Only when all Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael, then they're chayiv and chala. Amarti, that's when I say Yechayiv, v'loi bevias mikzaschem. And not if only some of the Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Rav Huna Rav Yeshua explained, v'chiyaskinu Ezra, when Ezra brought the Yidden back to Eretz Yisrael at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, lav kula salak. Not everybody came to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, even if today Terumah would be Menat Torah, Chala is not Menat Torah. Because Chala is only when all Yidden are together in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so this is the conversation where we see that there was a discussion, there was an argument regarding Terumah and Chala b'zman hazeh, if it's Menat Torah or Midrabanan. The Gemara continues, trying to prove the question we have, could I establish a person's yichus as a kayin based on him doing birchas kayinim? Tashamat says in another brayse, chazaka lekohone, to establish the status of a kayin, nesiyas kapayim. You can rely on him doing nesiyas kapayim. And v'chilus granos. And also if he's getting the truma when where it's being distributed. And also ve'edus. If there's testimony, to sort of simple pshat it sounds like, what that means is, if there's clear edim telling us who his father is, who his mother is, so therefore, of course, we could know that he's a kain. So the Gemara asks, what does this mean? Edus. If we have testimony saying that he's a kain, chazaki, so that means that we're establishing this based on a chazaka. The Brayse began saying that the following are the chazakas that we could use. So why does it conclude saying that we have clear edus here? Elalav hachikama. Don't you think that this is what the Brayse, when it says edus, it means the following? Nisiyas kapayim ki edus. It really meant if we know that he's doing birchas kayanim, that's the equivalent of edus. It's like we have clear testimony that he's a kayin. So ma edus liyuchsin, just like when we have clear edus, we could establish his yichus. After nisiyas kapayim liyuchsin, so too when we see him doing birchas kayanim, we could also establish his yichus. So the Gemara answers, loi, that's not necessarily the pshat. When the Brayse says eidos, it meant something else. Eidos haba mikoyach chazake. Eidos that are not telling us, we know clearly who his father is, who his mother is, but the eidos come and tell us that he's a kayin based on a certain status that was established. But they don't know for a fact who his father and mother is. Now, what exactly was this status that they saw established? So, this is a good status that we could establish him as a kain. And the Gemara brings what it's referring to, the following incident that happened. Like the story with a person that came in front of Rabami, and he said to Rabami, I know for a fact that this person is a kain. So what did you see that you know that he's a kain? So he said to him, he was called up for the aliyah at the Torah as the first aliyah. So I know he's a kain. So Rabami asks him, not necessarily. B'cheskas shu kayin or b'cheskas shu gadol? Does that mean that he's a kayin or he was the greatest person in the Bismedish? That's also, you give sometimes the first aliyah to the person that's the gadol, the greatest person. So who says he's a kayin? So he answered him, no. Shekara achrav Levi. What happened is, after he got the aliyah, the next aliyah, a Levi got the aliyah. So, and if you give a gadol, which is Yisrael the aliyah, so then after that you don't give a Levi. As Rashi brings from the Gemara and Gittin, once you give a Yisrael the first, after that you don't give a Levi. So therefore, based on the aliyah that he got, I know that he's a kayin. V'helo Rabami l'kon al piv. And Rabami accepted this and he established him being a kayin according to this testimony. Okay, so therefore we can say that this is the pshat on the Brayse before. When it says Eidos, it means an Eidos that saw this status. He saw him getting this aliyah. That's what we can base it on. Gemara brings another story similar. Someone came in front of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and he said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, I know for a fact that this person is a Levi. What did you see that you know he's a Levi? Because he got the second aliyah in the Beis HaKnesses. So he asks him, B'cheskas shu Levi or B'cheskas shu Gadol? Is this that he was a Levi, or maybe because of his greatness they gave him the second aliyah? So he said, no, it can't be because he's a great person, because Shekara lefan of Kayin, because the Kayin got before. And the halacha is that when the Kayin gets Rishayin, the Levi is the one that gets Sheni. So I know that he's a Levi. V'hello, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, l'leviyah al piv. Again, he used this testimony about his aliyah to establish his status that he's a Levi. Says the Gemara, Hahud asal kamed Reish Lakish. An individual came in front of Reish Lakish, Amalei, and he said to Reish Lakish, Muchzakani b'zeh kain. I know for a fact that this individual is a kain. Amalei, so he said to him, Mari, so what did you see? How do you know he's a kain? Amalei, so he said, Shekara rishon b'veis HaKnesses, because he got the first aliyah in Shul. Amalei, so Reish Lakish said to him, that's not enough. Re'isav shechilek al agronis? Did you see when they were distributing the truma that he was there accepting truma? So Amalei Rabbi Elazar was also present there, and Rabbi Elazar says to Rish Lakish, Vim ein sham gaiden. If there's no truma that's being given out in this place, batla kahuna, so then there's no kahuna anymore. We can't establish that he's a kain, even in a time when there's no truma, just by the fact that he got this aliyah. Okay, that's it. That was a conversation between Rabbi Elazar and Rish Lakish. Now Zimnin, there was one time, Havi Yasvi Kamei de Rabbi Yechanan. So both Rish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar were sitting in front of Rabbi Yechanan, and Asa Kiha Maisel Kamei. The same exact story came here in front of when they were sitting there. One person came and said, I could establish this person as a kain because I saw him getting an aliyah. Amalei Rish Lakish, and Rish Lakish now said the same thing to him. Did you see that he got the truma by the storage houses? Amalei Rabbi Yechanan, and not Rabbi Yechanan that was there, piped up and said, V'mein sham gaiden batla kahuna. And if there's no gaiden, so we were mevatel the status of kahuna. In other words, you can't establish a status as a kain just by the aliyah that he got. So what happened? So what happened was Rish Lakish looked at Rabbi Elazar with a bad eye. Rashi explains the reason is because Rish Lakish realized that when Rabbi Elazar said this comment the first time, it wasn't him, it wasn't his comment. He heard it from his teacher Rabbi Yechanan. So Rish Lakish sort of was upset at him. Why didn't you tell me that you heard this from your teacher? Why did you make believe as if you are the one that said that you could rely on the aliyah and it's not necessary to establish it based on the truma that he got? Okay. Omar, he says to him, Shamet mili de Barnafche. You heard this comment that you said from Barnafche. Barnafche is expression for Rabbi Yechanan, either because his father was a nafche, his father was a blacksmith, or actually Rashi says in Sanhedrin, another pshat, that his father was very beautiful. So I guess it's like a sort of a term, like sort of a derogatory term that's used for a beautiful person. And you didn't tell me that you heard it from in his name. Why did you make believe as if this is your own comment? Okay, in connection to all of this, the Gemara brings another two halachas here regarding establishing the status of a kain. Rabbi v'Rab Chiya. So we have Rabbi and Rab Chiya. Chad hela ben al pi Yaviv. One of them, so he established the status of a son based on his father, l'kohuna. His father said that this is my son and he's a kain. So we established it based on the father, even though usually a father is a relative, we don't trust the father. But Rabbi established it based on the father. V'chad hela och al pi Yachiv. And one of them, he established that a brother is a Levi based on his brother that said testimony that this is my brother. So the Gemara will here bring that we could know who is the one that did what. To Stayim, I'll prove to you the Rebbe Hela ben al pi Aviv, that Rebbe is the one that established the status of a son based on his father, l'kohona for kohona. The Tanya, because we learned in the Braisa as follows: Harei Shabava, a person comes and says, Bini zeh v'kayin hu, this is my son and he's a kayin. Neman la'chiloi b'truma. He's believed that he's a kayin and he could give him to eat truma. But ve'enei neman la'siyah isha. But we don't believe the father that will now accept that this is a kayin, that this is his son, that we'll marry him off to a kosher wife. We have no idea who this person is. He could, for all we know, he could be a mamzer, he could be someone that's puzzle. Divrei Rabbi. This is Rabbi's opinion. So by the way, you see right over here that when Rabbi says that the father could establish a son as a kayin, it's only for truma, but not for the yichus. For the yichus, we're not going to trust the father to establish a son as a kayin. Now, Amalei Rab Chiya asked Rabbi, if you're trusting him that he should eat truma, you should also trust the father that he should be able to marry a wife. He should be considered to be a kosher yid. If you don't trust the father to marry him off to a kosher wife, you should not trust him to eat truma. Why are these two different? Taisus actually points out that Rab Chiya never meant to ask that they should mamish be the same, because it's clear, it's understood that eating truma and allowing a person to go and marry a kosher wife is not exactly the same thing. But what he meant to ask is that if you're allowing him to eat truma just based on the testimony of the father alone, you should then at least trust the father together with one more eid echad to believe them that he should be able to go and marry a kosher wife. That's what he meant to say. There's a discussion here in Taisus here, because to say that these two are equivalent is a little bit difficult. We already had before that truma and yichus is not exactly the same thing.
So what's enough to marry a Kohen?
Again?
What else in addition do you need in order to have that aid? What other requirements do you need in order to...
So in this case, Taisus says if it's a father's a relative, he's a negei b'davar, so the father would need another aid together with him. That's what Rab Chiya was suggesting.
But that to marry, but what about to marry a Kohen?
Oh, to be able to marry a Kayin, that's a different story. Here we're talking about a Kayin, and the question is, do we consider him to be a Kayin? He could marry any kosher wife.
Kosher wife.
That's the question.
Okay.
Amalei, so Rebbe explains, what's the difference between trusting him to eat trumah and trusting him that his son could marry anybody? I trust the father that he can give him to eat trumah. Because this is something that the father has control over. This is something that is in the father's hands. The father is a kohen, the father gets the trumah, and he's going to feed the trumah to all of the people in his family. So if he says, this is my son a kohen, he's going to feed him trumah. But I don't believe the father that this is his son, that he can marry a good wife, a kosher wife. This is not something that's in the father's control at all. The son gets married on his own. The father can't marry off a son. So therefore, biyada is something that's in the father's control. That's something that he has more trust to say that his son is a kohen. That's the difference. Now the Gemara. So here we see this is Rebbe. So to Stayim, we have a proof. We know that Rebbe was the one that established a son as a kohen based on the father's testimony. And again, this is only for eating truma. Now, so here that we see that the story was Rebbe is the one that allowed a son to be considered a kohen based on the father's testimony. So the other story that there was a brother that said testimony that my brother is a Levi. That was in the case of the brothers. That's Rab Chia. So now the question is on what Rab Chia did. Ma'ishna ben Deloy. What's the difference that according to Rab Chia, he was arguing with Rebbe, and he was telling Rebbe, you can't rely on a father to establish the son as a kohen, even to eat trumah. The karevu, because the father is a relative, we don't trust a relative. Karevu etzelav, a relative to the father. Achnami karevu etzelachav. The same should be with the brother. How can we trust one brother to say about his brother that this is a Levi? And we never trust a relative as such a thing. So the Gemara answers, you're right, the only time that Rab Chia said regarding a relative by a brother, and the same would be by a father, that we trust them is b'masiach lefi tumai. When a person is speaking just sincerely in a conversation, he's not saying this as a testimony for this matter, but he's just saying it sincerely in a conversation. And the Gemara brings an incident that happened. As Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, there was a story with a person, he was just sincerely speaking and sharing about his youth. He said, I remember when I was a child, and I was riding on my father's shoulder. He took me out of the school. He took off my shirt. And he put me in the mikveh so that I could eat trumah in the evening. And then Rab Chia concluded this statement over here that this person said, that he's added, my friends would separate from me. They would refer to me, Yochanan, the one that eats chalas, because he's a kohen, and therefore people separated from him. They didn't want that he should become tamei. And Rebbe established this person's status as a kohen based on what he himself said about himself, even though, of course, usually we can't establish a person as a kohen based on what he says about himself. But because over here it was masiach lefi tumai, he was just saying this sincerely, so therefore there's no reason to suspect that he's lying, so we trust him. So that's the same thing like Rab Chia said here. Rab Chia said before that a brother could say about his brother that he's a Levi only in a case where he's masiach lefi tumai. But in a regular case, of course, we wouldn't trust a relative to testify about a relative status.